You've been lied to about love, power, and what it really means to be fulfilled. For centuries, historians have painted Catherine the Great as a sexually insatiable ruler who collected lovers like trophies. But here's the shocking truth they don't want you to know. Despite having over 30 documented lovers throughout her reign, this woman, who controlled the largest empire on earth, died utterly alone, emotionally starved, and desperately searching for something that all her power and passion couldn't provide. What if I told you that the most powerful woman in 18th century Europe, a ruler who expanded Russian territory by 200,000 square miles, who corresponded with Voltaire and revolutionized education, spent her final years writing heartbreaking letters about the emptiness that no amount of physical intimacy could fill? The woman who could command armies and reshape nations couldn't command love. And the reasons why reveal something profound about human connection that modern science is only beginning to understand. In this exploration, we'll uncover the real story behind Catherine's legendary romantic life, ranked from her earliest relationships to her most desperate final attempts at connection. We'll reveal why each lover left her more isolated than before, and how her pursuit of physical intimacy actually drove her further from the emotional fulfillment she craved. Stick around, because the final relationship on this list exposes the heartbreaking truth about why the most powerful people often become the loneliest, and what modern psychology tells us about the connection between power and authentic love. Every detail in this story is backed by historical documents, personal letters, and court records that have been preserved for over 2 centuries. The references to her correspondence with lovers, her private diaries, and witness accounts from court officials are all documented and can be verified through the Russian State Archives and the Hermitage Collection. But before we dive into this tragic tale of power and loneliness, let us know in the comments, what do you think drives successful people to seek validation through multiple relationships? Drop your thoughts below. We are reading and responding to every single comment because understanding human psychology is what makes these historical stories so relevant today. Now, without any further delay, let's begin with relationship number 10, where Catherine's pattern of using power to attract love first began to form. This wasn't the most destructive relationship, but it's where her emotional isolation truly started. Number 10, Sergei Saltykov. When 15-year-old Sophie Friederike Auguste, who would later become Catherine the Great, first arrived at the Russian court as the intended bride for the future Peter III, she was a naive German princess who believed in fairy tale romance. Her first affair with the charming and experienced Sergei Saltykov would shatter those illusions forever and set the template for every relationship that followed. Saltykov was everything young Catherine thought she wanted. Handsome, witty, well-connected at court, and most importantly, he paid attention to her when her husband-to-be Peter showed nothing but indifference and contempt. What Catherine didn't understand at just 15 years old was that Saltykov had been specifically chosen by Empress Elizabeth to seduce her. The court needed Catherine to produce an heir, and everyone knew Peter was incapable or unwilling to fulfill his marital duties. The relationship began with stolen glances during court ceremonies and secret notes passed through trusted servants. Catherine later wrote in her memoirs that she felt alive for the first time when Saltykov would smile at her across a crowded ballroom. Here was a man who seemed to see her as more than just a political pawn, more than just a vessel for producing the next generation of Romanov heirs. For months, she believed she had found genuine love. But Catherine was being used, manipulated by forces far beyond her understanding. Saltykov was following orders, playing a role designed to ensure the succession. When Catherine became pregnant, possibly with his child rather than Peter's, Saltykov's mission was complete. He was quietly transferred to a diplomatic post in Sweden. vanishing from Catherine's life as suddenly as he had entered it. The abandonment devastated young Catherine, but it also taught her a crucial lesson that would shape every relationship that followed. Love, she learned, was a transaction. Affection could be performed, loyalty could be bought, and even the most intimate connections were ultimately about power, politics, and personal gain. She would never again make the mistake of believing someone loved her for herself alone. This first betrayal created an emotional fortress around Catherine's heart that no future lover would ever fully breach. She began to see relationships as chess games where she needed to maintain the upper hand, where vulnerability was weakness, and genuine emotional connection was impossible. The young princess who had dreamed of romantic love died in that relationship. What emerged was a woman who would use sex and romance as tools of control, never understanding that this approach guaranteed the very loneliness she was trying to escape. Number 9. Stanisław Poniatowski. Catherine's relationship with the Polish nobleman Stanisław Poniatowski represented her first attempt to wield romantic power deliberately, and it would become a blueprint for how she confused political dominance with emotional intimacy. Unlike her naive affair with Saltykov, Catherine entered this relationship as an active participant in court intrigue, using her sexuality as a weapon in the complex game of European politics. Poniatowski arrived at the Russian court in 1755 as part of a British diplomatic mission, and Catherine was immediately drawn to his intelligence, his progressive political ideas, and his obvious fascination with her. But what made this relationship different was that Catherine was no longer the powerless teenager who had been manipulated by Saltykov. Now, she was a Grand Duchess with growing influence, and she consciously decided to use Poniatowski for both emotional and political purposes. The affair was passionate and intellectually stimulating in ways that Catherine had never experienced. Poniatowski shared her love of Enlightenment philosophy, her dreams of political reform, and her frustration with the backward-looking policies of Empress Elizabeth's court. They would spend hours discussing Montesquieu and Diderot, planning how they might reshape Russia and Poland according to rational, progressive principles. For Catherine, it felt like she had finally found not just a lover, but a true partner. But Catherine made a crucial error that would repeat throughout her romantic life. She confused intellectual compatibility and shared ambitions with genuine emotional intimacy. Poniatowski loved Catherine's mind and was certainly attracted to her body, but he was equally attracted to her political potential. He saw her as a route to power, a way to advance his own career and his family's influence in Polish politics. Catherine, meanwhile, convinced herself that this mixture of politics and passion represented true love. She used her position to advance Poniatowski's career, arranging for him to receive lucrative court appointments and ensuring he had access to sensitive diplomatic information. When she became pregnant with his child, she felt they were bound together by something deeper than mere attraction. The relationship's end revealed how little emotional foundation it actually had. When political pressures forced Poniatowski to leave Russia, Catherine discovered that their grand romantic connection couldn't survive the practical challenges of separation and competing loyalties. Poniatowski quickly became involved with other women and other political schemes. Catherine, despite her power and influence, found herself once again abandoned by someone she thought truly loved her. The most devastating part was what happened after Catherine became empress. She made Poniatowski king of Poland, using her imperial power to place her former lover on a throne. She convinced herself this was a romantic gesture, a way of maintaining their connection across borders. But Poniatowski's subsequent rule proved he had learned her lessons about using relationships for political gain. He governed as Catherine's puppet, but his personal loyalty was always to his own survival and his own interests. Catherine began to understand that even when she held all the power, even when she could literally make her lovers into kings, she couldn't make them love her authentically. This realization pushed her toward an even more controlling approach to relationships. If genuine connection was impossible, she would at least ensure that her lovers were completely dependent on her favor, that they couldn't leave her as easily as the others had. Number 8. Grigory Orlov. With Grigory Orlov, Catherine thought she had finally solved the puzzle of love and power. Here was a man who helped her seize the throne, who seemed to want her for herself rather than for political advancement, and who appeared content to live in her orbit without competing for dominance. For nearly 12 years, longer than any other relationship in her life, Catherine believed she had found the perfect balance between romantic passion and imperial authority. The ultimate irony is that this longest relationship would teach her the most painful lesson about the impossibility of authentic love when power dynamics are so fundamentally unequal. Orlov was a guards officer, part of the military elite but not a member of the high nobility. When Catherine met him, she was still the wife of the increasingly unstable Peter III, plotting her path to power, but unsure how to execute her plans. Orlov and his brothers provided the military muscle she needed for her coup, but Grigory offered something else entirely. He was tall, handsome, physically powerful, and completely devoted to Catherine's cause. The relationship began in the midst of revolution. As Catherine planned her husband's overthrow, she and Orlov conducted a passionate affair that combined political conspiracy with intense physical attraction. When Catherine successfully seized power in 1762, Orlov was beside her every step of the way. He commanded the troops that arrested Peter III. He secured the loyalty of key military units, and he helped ensure that Catherine's transition from wife to empress was swift and decisive. For Catherine, this felt like destiny. Here was a man who had literally helped her achieve ultimate power, who asked for nothing more than to serve her and love her. Unlike Poniatowski, who had his own political agenda, or Saltykov, who had been following orders from others, Orlov seemed to want only Catherine herself. She made him a count, gave him enormous estates, and treated him as her unofficial consort. For nearly a decade, they appeared to be not just lovers, but genuine partners. But Catherine's understanding of the relationship was fatally flawed. She believed Orlov loved her for her personal qualities, when, in reality, his entire identity had become tied to his role as the Empress's favorite. Orlov had no independent power base, no separate political identity, no life apart from his position in Catherine's bed and court. What Catherine interpreted as selfless love was actually complete dependence. This became clear as the years progressed and Catherine's political priorities shifted. Orlov had been crucial during the coup and the early years of Catherine's reign, when she needed military support and physical protection. But as her power became more secure, she needed different kinds of advisors. She required diplomats, legal experts, administrative specialists, men who could help her govern a vast empire rather than simply fight for her. Orlov couldn't adapt to these changing needs. He remained the same man he had been during the coup, focused on military matters and court intrigue, but lacking the intellectual sophistication Catherine increasingly required in her inner circle. Catherine began to find him intellectually limiting, politically naive, and embarrassingly out of place in diplomatic negotiations with European powers. The relationship's end was particularly painful because it revealed how little genuine emotional connection they had actually shared. When Catherine finally dismissed Orlov in 1772, he was devastated, not just romantically but existentially. He had no identity apart from being Catherine's lover, no purpose beyond serving her needs. Catherine, meanwhile, discovered that she felt relief rather than loss. She had confused gratitude and dependency with love, just as Orlov had confused access to power with genuine affection. The most telling moment came when Orlov attempted to win Catherine back by achieving military glory in fighting the Ottoman Empire. He imagined that success on the battlefield would remind Catherine why she had valued him. But Catherine had moved beyond needing that kind of validation. She wanted intellectual stimulation, political sophistication, and emotional subtlety that Orlov simply couldn't provide. His military victories felt irrelevant to the woman she had become. Catherine began to understand that the very power which attracted men to her also made authentic love impossible. Orlov had loved her position more than her person. But even worse, she had loved the way he reflected her power back to her, rather than challenging her to grow as a human being. She started to realize that she might be condemned to relationships where love was always contaminated by ambition, where authenticity was always compromised by inequality. Number 7. Alexander Vasilchikov. After the intensity and eventual disappointment of her relationship with Orlov, Catherine attempted something completely different with Alexander Vasilchikov. She chose a man who was young, beautiful, politically unambitious, and seemingly content to serve as nothing more than a court ornament. Catherine convinced herself that this approach would finally give her the uncomplicated affection she craved. Instead, it taught her that relationships without intellectual depth or emotional challenge were just as hollow as those contaminated by political scheming. Vasilchikov was 28 years old when Catherine, now 43, selected him to replace Orlov as her official favorite. He was extraordinarily handsome, impeccably mannered, and from a respectable noble family, but he possessed none of Orlov's military experience or political connections. Catherine seemed to believe that these limitations were actually advantages. Here was a man who couldn't threaten her authority, couldn't manipulate her for political gain, and couldn't abandon her for other opportunities. The relationship was pleasant and comfortable in ways Catherine had never experienced. Vasilchikov made no demands beyond the generous financial support Catherine provided. He didn't pressure her to involve him in government decisions, didn't compete with her advisors for influence, and didn't create the kind of dramatic scenes that had marked her relationship with Orlov. For the first time in her romantic life, Catherine felt she could relax her guard, could simply enjoy being desired without worrying about ulterior motives. But Catherine quickly discovered that comfort wasn't the same as fulfillment. Vasilchikov's lack of ambition, which had initially seemed appealing, soon began to feel like a lack of substance. He had no opinions about the political and philosophical questions that fascinated Catherine, no insights about governing, no passion for the ideas that drove her. Conversations with him were limited to court gossip, fashion, and social pleasantries. More troubling for Catherine was Vasilchikov's obvious fear of her power. While Orlov had been comfortable wielding influence and making demands, Vasilchikov was clearly intimidated by Catherine's imperial authority. He was deferential to the point of servility, agreeing with everything she said and anticipating her every wish. Catherine realized she wanted a partner who could challenge her intellectually and emotionally, not a beautiful pet who simply reflected her own opinions back to her. The relationship also highlighted Catherine's growing awareness of her own aging. With Vasilchikov, 15 years her junior, she became acutely conscious of the fact that her sexual appeal was increasingly tied to her political power rather than her physical attractiveness. Young, beautiful men were willing to sleep with an aging empress, but Catherine began to suspect that none of them would have looked at her twice if she had been an ordinary woman. This realization was profoundly depressing. Catherine had always prided herself on her intelligence, her wit, and her personal magnetism. But with Vasilchikov, she felt reduced to nothing more than a source of wealth and status. He desired her position, not her person, and he was too young and inexperienced to even pretend otherwise convincingly. The end of the relationship came after less than 2 years, when Catherine simply grew bored with Vasilchikov's limitations. She dismissed him gently, providing him with a generous financial settlement and a respectable position in the imperial administration. Vasilchikov accepted his dismissal with the same passive compliance he had shown throughout their affair, confirming Catherine's suspicions about his true feelings. Catherine emerged from this relationship with a deeper understanding of her own needs and a growing pessimism about the possibility of meeting them. She required intellectual stimulation, emotional depth, and genuine challenge in her relationships. But she also required loyalty, discretion, and acceptance of her supreme authority. These needs seemed increasingly incompatible. Men who could match her intellectually often threatened her politically, while men who accepted her dominance often bored her personally. She began to develop the approach that would characterize her later relationships. Since authentic love seemed impossible, she would at least ensure that her arrangements were mutually beneficial and clearly understood by both parties. She would provide wealth, status, and access to power in exchange for companionship, sexual availability, and emotional support. It was a more honest approach than pretending these were romantic relationships, but it was also a more lonely one. Number 6. Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin represents the most complex and ultimately most devastating relationship of Catherine's life, because he was the only man who could have been her intellectual and emotional equal, the only lover who understood both her personal needs and her imperial responsibilities. Their relationship lasted in various forms for nearly 20 years, and it came closer to authentic partnership than any other connection Catherine ever experienced. The tragedy is that even this relationship, her deepest and most significant, ultimately confirmed her growing belief that true love was impossible for someone in her position. When Potemkin first arrived at court in 1774, Catherine immediately recognized something different about him. He was brilliant, well-educated, politically sophisticated, and personally charismatic in ways that reminded her of the Enlightenment philosophers she admired. Unlike her previous lovers, Potemkin had his own ideas about governance, his own vision for Russia's future, and his own considerable abilities. He could match Catherine intellectually, while still accepting her ultimate authority. The initial phase of their relationship was unlike anything Catherine had experienced. Potemkin was passionate, but not subservient, ambitious, but not manipulative, intelligent, but not threatening to her position. He seemed to love Catherine for exactly the qualities that made her an effective ruler: her intelligence, her decisiveness, her grand vision for Russian expansion and modernization. For the first time, Catherine felt that her power enhanced rather than complicated a romantic relationship. Their correspondence during this period reveals a depth of emotional intimacy that Catherine had never achieved with anyone else. Potemkin called her his beloved little mother, and wrote letters filled with genuine affection, intellectual respect, and personal vulnerability. Catherine responded with equal warmth, sharing her fears, her hopes, and her most private thoughts. Some historians believe they may have secretly married during this period, though no definitive proof exists. But even this extraordinary relationship contained the seeds of its own destruction. Potemkin's very capabilities, the qualities that made him such an appealing partner, also made him unsuitable as a permanent consort. He was too powerful, too independent, too much of a political force in his own right to remain in the subordinate position that any of Catherine's lovers ultimately occupied. As Potemkin's own influence grew, particularly through his management of Catherine's southern expansion and his leadership in the wars against the Ottoman Empire, the dynamic of their relationship began to shift. He became less of a lover and more of a partner in imperial governance. This should have been exactly what Catherine wanted, but she discovered that sharing power was almost as problematic as the alternatives she had tried. Potemkin's successes made him increasingly independent of Catherine's favor. He developed his own power base, his own network of allies, his own political agenda. While he remained loyal to Catherine and to the Russian Empire, he was no longer the devoted lover who existed solely to serve her personal and political needs. Catherine found herself competing with Potemkin's other interests, his military campaigns, his administrative responsibilities, his own ambitions. The relationship evolved into something unique in Catherine's romantic history, a long-term partnership between equals that included periods of sexual intimacy, alternating with political collaboration and personal friendship. Potemkin would remain Catherine's closest advisor for the rest of his life, but their romantic relationship became intermittent and complicated by their respective involvement with other people. This arrangement satisfied Catherine's intellectual and political needs better than any other relationship, but it left her emotional needs largely unmet. Potemkin loved and respected Catherine, but he loved Russia and his own achievements equally. Catherine could never be certain whether his loyalty was to her as a person or to her as an empress. Even worse, she began to suspect that the distinction was meaningless, that her identity as a person had become so completely merged with her role as ruler that authentic personal love was no longer possible. The most painful aspect of the Potemkin relationship was how it demonstrated that even when Catherine found someone capable of genuine partnership, the demands of imperial rule made sustained emotional intimacy impossible. Potemkin was often away from court for months or years at a time, managing military campaigns or governing distant provinces. When they were together, their interactions were increasingly dominated by political and administrative concerns rather than personal connection. Catherine began to realize that the very qualities that made her an effective ruler, her need for control, her inability to show vulnerability, her tendency to subordinate personal needs to political considerations, made her unsuitable for the kind of deep emotional connection she craved. Even with Potemkin, who understood and accepted these limitations better than anyone else, she found herself unable to prioritize love over power when the two came into conflict. Number 5, Peter Zawodowski. Catherine's relationship with Peter Zawodowski marked the beginning of her most systematic and ultimately most desperate period of romantic searching. After the complex disappointments of the Potemkin arrangement, Catherine decided to return to a more straightforward approach to relationships. She would find young, attractive, politically manageable men who could provide companionship and sexual satisfaction without threatening her authority or creating emotional complications. Zawodowski was her first attempt at this new strategy, and his treatment would establish a pattern that became increasingly compulsive and self-destructive. Zawodowski was a 30-year-old Ukrainian nobleman with a good education, pleasant manners, and no significant political connections when Catherine selected him as Potemkin's replacement in 1776. Potemkin himself had recommended Zawodowski, which should have warned Catherine about the fundamental problems with this arrangement. She was essentially asking one lover to choose his successor, treating romantic relationships as administrative appointments rather than emotional connections. Catherine approached the Zawodowski relationship with a new level of calculated detachment. She provided him with the standard benefits of imperial favor: a substantial salary, luxurious apartments in the palace, expensive gifts, and elevated social status. In return, she expected availability, discretion, and basic companionship. It was an explicitly transactional arrangement, which Catherine convinced herself was more honest than pretending to seek authentic love. But Catherine discovered that even relationships designed to avoid emotional complications could become emotionally devastating. Despite her intentions, she found herself genuinely caring for Zawodowski, enjoying his company, and feeling hurt when he seemed to take her favor for granted. She wanted him to appreciate not just the material benefits of their arrangement, but her personal attention, her affection, her efforts to make him happy. Zawodowski, meanwhile, was clearly uncomfortable with his role. Unlike some of Catherine's later favorites who seemed genuinely content with their position, Zawodowski felt degraded by the arrangement. He was an educated man with his own ambitions and self-respect, and being kept as the Empress's sexual companion, however generously compensated, damaged his sense of personal dignity. The relationship became increasingly tense as Catherine realized that Zawodowski was not grateful for her attention, but rather resentful of his dependence on it. He began to make demands, to complain about his treatment, to suggest that he deserved more respect and more substantial political appointments. Catherine was shocked by these complaints. She had given Zawodowski wealth, status, and access to the most exclusive social circles in Europe. How could he be dissatisfied? This response revealed how completely Catherine had lost touch with normal human emotional needs. She couldn't understand that Zawodowski might want to feel valued for his own qualities rather than simply rewarded for his sexual services. She couldn't comprehend that her generosity, however lavish, couldn't compensate for the fundamental inequality and artificiality of their relationship. The end came after 18 months when Zawodowski finally expressed his desire to leave court and return to his estates. Catherine was devastated by what she interpreted as rejection and ingratitude. She had tried to be fair, generous, and emotionally detached, but she still found herself abandoned by someone she had grown to care about. The failure of this carefully managed relationship convinced Catherine that her problems weren't just about finding the right person or structuring arrangements properly. The problem was deeper and more fundamental. Catherine began to understand that her need for emotional connection was in direct conflict with her position as absolute ruler. Even when she tried to keep relationships simple and transactional, she couldn't help wanting more than physical companionship. She wanted affection, gratitude, loyalty, and respect. But these emotional goods couldn't be purchased or commanded, and her imperial power actually made authentic expressions of these feelings impossible. The Zawodowski experience marked the beginning of Catherine's descent into what can only be described as romantic desperation. If calculated detachment didn't work any better than passionate involvement, then perhaps the problem was that she wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't offering enough incentives, wasn't finding the right men. This logic would drive her toward increasingly frantic attempts to buy the love that continued to elude her. Number 4. Simon Zorich. With Simon Zorich, Catherine's romantic strategy became even more systematic and ultimately more pathetic. She had learned from previous relationships that intellectual equals were too threatening, that ambitious men were too manipulative, and that even carefully managed arrangements could become emotionally complicated. With Zorich, she tried a different approach. She would find someone so obviously inferior in every way, except physical attractiveness, that there could be no pretense about the nature of their relationship. The tragic irony is that this most honest approach to her romantic needs would leave her feeling more used and more lonely than any of the previous arrangements. Zorich was a Serbian military officer who had come to Russian service as a refugee after fighting against the Ottoman Empire in his homeland. He was 25 years old, strikingly handsome, and possessed of the kind of exotic foreign appeal that had always attracted Catherine. More importantly, he was completely dependent on Russian hospitality for his survival, and had no political connections or personal resources that might make him a threat to Catherine's authority. Catherine convinced herself that Zorich's obvious limitations were actually advantages. He couldn't manipulate her because he lacked the sophistication for complex schemes. He couldn't abandon her because he had nowhere else to go. He couldn't threaten her because he had no independent power base. It seemed like the perfect solution to the problems that had plagued her previous relationships. The relationship began with Catherine's most lavish display of imperial generosity, yet she gave Zorik a palace, a massive financial allowance, extensive lands in Ukraine, and a collection of expensive gifts that would have made European princes envious. She was essentially buying a companion, and she was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to ensure his complete dependence and loyalty. For a brief period, the arrangement seemed to work exactly as Catherine had planned. Zorik was grateful, attentive, and obviously thrilled with his dramatic change in circumstances. He had gone from being a penniless refugee to being one of the wealthiest men in the Russian Empire. Catherine enjoyed his physical attentiveness and felt satisfied that she had finally created a relationship that couldn't hurt her emotionally, because she had no illusions about its romantic nature. But Catherine's psychological needs proved more complex than she had anticipated. Even though she consciously understood that Zorik was with her only because of what she could provide, she still found herself wanting him to show genuine affection, to appreciate her personal qualities, to demonstrate some loyalty beyond what his financial dependence required. She wanted to feel desired rather than merely tolerated. Zorik, meanwhile, quickly became comfortable with his new status and began to take Catherine's generosity for granted. He developed expensive tastes, demanded ever more lavish gifts, and started to treat Catherine with a casual familiarity that bordered on disrespect. Rather than being grateful for his elevation, he began to act as if her attention and financial support were his due. The relationship's worst aspect was how it made Catherine feel about herself. With previous lovers, she could at least pretend that they were attracted to her intelligence, her power, or her personal charisma. With Zorik, it was clear that he was simply enduring her company in exchange for material benefits. Catherine found herself in the degrading position of paying for affection from someone who obviously found her sexually unappealing and personally boring. The end came when Zorik became involved with a younger woman at court, carrying on the affair with a carelessness that made it obvious to everyone, including Catherine. When Catherine confronted him, Zorik showed no shame or remorse. He seemed to feel that as long as he fulfilled his basic obligations to Catherine, he was free to seek pleasure elsewhere. Catherine realized that she had created a relationship so purely transactional that even basic fidelity couldn't be expected. Catherine dismissed Zorik with the same lavish generosity she had shown in promoting him, providing him with enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But the experience left her profoundly shaken. She had tried every approach she could imagine to romantic relationships, from passionate affairs to intellectual partnerships to calculated arrangements, and each had ended in disappointment and emotional pain. The Zorik relationship taught Catherine that even when she abandoned all pretense of seeking authentic love, even when she reduced relationships to their most basic transactional elements, she still couldn't protect herself from hurt and humiliation. Her need for emotional connection was stronger than her ability to suppress it, but her position made genuine emotional connection impossible. She was trapped between needs she couldn't eliminate and circumstances she couldn't change. Number 3. Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov. By the time Catherine began her relationship with Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov in 1786, she had developed what could only be described as a systematic approach to romantic disappointment. She knew exactly how these arrangements would begin, develop, and end, but she seemed unable to stop herself from pursuing them anyway. The Dmitriev-Mamonov relationship represents Catherine at her most self-aware and simultaneously her most tragic, desperately seeking emotional connection while fully understanding its impossibility. Dmitriev Mamonov was 26 when Catherine, now 57, selected him as her favorite. He came from a respectable noble family, had received a good education, and possessed the combination of physical attractiveness and intellectual adequacy that Catherine had learned to prefer. Unlike some of her previous choices, Dmitriev Mamonov was sophisticated enough to be good company, but not threatening enough to challenge her authority. Catherine approached this relationship with a new level of conscious calculation. She had studied her own patterns, understood her psychological needs, and developed what she believed was a sustainable model for romantic arrangements. She would provide material benefits, expect companionship and sexual availability in return, and avoid emotional investment that could lead to disappointment. But Catherine's letters during this period reveal how completely she had failed to protect herself emotionally. Despite her intellectual understanding of the relationship's nature, she still found herself caring deeply about Dmitriev Mamonov's opinions, worrying about his moods, and seeking his approval and affection. She couldn't help wanting more than he was prepared to give, more than the arrangement realistically allowed. Dmitriev Mamonov, for his part, played his role competently, but without any real enthusiasm. He was polite, attentive when required, and discreet about his obvious lack of genuine attraction to Catherine. He seemed to understand that his position required a certain level of performance, and he fulfilled his obligations professionally. But Catherine was too experienced not to recognize the difference between performed affection and authentic feeling. The relationship's most painful aspect was Catherine's growing awareness of how predictable and repetitive her romantic life had become. She could anticipate exactly how Dmitriev Mamonov would behave in various situations, exactly what kinds of gifts would please him, exactly how long the arrangement would last before he became restless or she became bored. The spontaneity and emotional surprise that make relationships meaningful had been completely eliminated. Catherine began to feel like she was trapped in an endless cycle of her own creation. Her position required her to maintain relationships that provided companionship and sexual fulfillment. But every relationship reinforced her isolation and emotional frustration. She was getting older, less physically attractive, and more obviously dependent on her imperial power to attract men, but she seemed unable to accept a life without romantic arrangements. The end of the Dmitriev Mamonov relationship was particularly devastating, because it revealed how little emotional growth Catherine had achieved despite decades of experience. When Dmitriev Mamonov fell genuinely in love with a young woman at court and asked permission to marry her, Catherine responded with the same jealousy and sense of betrayal that had characterized her much earlier relationships. Catherine had always known intellectually that her favorites would eventually leave her, but she still felt personally rejected when it happened. She couldn't separate her role as empress from her needs as a woman, couldn't accept that someone might prefer authentic love with an equal to a comfortable arrangement with an absolute ruler. Her power, which should have made her more secure and less vulnerable to emotional hurt, actually made every rejection more painful because it forced her to confront the limitations of what imperial authority could achieve. The Dmitriev Mamonov experience convinced Catherine that her romantic life was not just unsuccessful, but actively harmful to her emotional well-being. Each relationship reinforced negative patterns, deepened her isolation, and made her more desperate for the kind of connection that her circumstances made impossible. She began to understand that the solution to her loneliness might require giving up the search for romantic fulfillment entirely. Number 2. Alexander Yermolov. Catherine's penultimate significant relationship with Alexander Yermolov represents her most desperate and ultimately most self-destructive attempt to find emotional fulfillment through romantic connection. By 1789, when this relationship began, Catherine was 60 years old and had been pursuing variations of the same romantic strategy for over 4 decades. The Yermolov affair reveals a woman who had learned nothing from her previous disappointments and everything about the impossibility of her situation. Yermolov was barely 21 when Catherine selected him, making him young enough to be her grandson. He was extraordinarily handsome, came from a military family with a tradition of service to the crown, and possessed the kind of naive enthusiasm that Catherine had come to prefer over sophistication or experience. She convinced herself that his youth was an advantage, because it meant he couldn't have developed the calculating cynicism that had characterized her more mature lovers. Catherine approached the Yermolov relationship with a level of emotional investment that was shocking considering her age and experience. She showered him with gifts, attention, and affection that went far beyond her usual generous but calculated approach. She wrote him passionate letters, planned elaborate entertainments for his pleasure, and seemed to genuinely believe that she could win his authentic love through the sheer intensity of her devotion. The relationship was doomed from the beginning by the ridiculous disparity between Catherine's needs and Yermolov's capacity to meet them. Catherine wanted a romantic partnership, emotional intimacy, and genuine affection from a young man who was old enough to be sexually attracted to women his own age, but too inexperienced to understand how to navigate a relationship with an aging empress. Yermolov was essentially being asked to perform a role for which he had no training and no natural inclination. What made the Yermolov relationship particularly tragic was how it exposed Catherine's complete loss of self-awareness. Despite decades of similar disappointments, she seemed to genuinely believe that this time would be different, that Yermolov's youth and apparent innocence meant he could love her authentically. She ignored the obvious signs of his discomfort, his boredom during their conversations, and his obvious relief when court duties provided him with excuses to avoid her company. Catherine's behavior during this period alarmed even her closest advisors. She was neglecting important state business to focus on Yermolov, making impulsive political decisions designed to impress him, and showing a level of emotional volatility that was completely out of character for someone who had ruled successfully for nearly 3 decades. Her courtiers began to worry that her infatuation was affecting her judgment and potentially threatening the stability of the empire. The relationship's most humiliating aspect was how obviously Yermolov was repulsed by Catherine's sexual demands. Unlike her previous lovers, who had at least been sophisticated enough to hide their true feelings, Yermolov lacked the experience and self-control to disguise his revulsion. Catherine found herself in the degrading position of forcing physical intimacy on someone who clearly found her touch unpleasant. Even worse, Yermolov began to show signs of genuine psychological distress under the pressure of maintaining his role. He became nervous, withdrawn, and obviously unhappy in ways that reminded Catherine uncomfortably of her own emotional state. She was creating in her lover the same kind of desperation and isolation that had characterized her own romantic life. The end came when Yermolov suffered what appears to have been a nervous breakdown, becoming unable to fulfill even the basic requirements of his position. Catherine was forced to dismiss him for his own mental health, providing him with a generous settlement and arranging for him to receive medical attention. The relationship had lasted less than 18 months, but it had damaged both participants in ways that previous arrangements had not. Catherine emerged from the Yermolov relationship with a new understanding of how completely her romantic life had become separated from any reasonable expectation of emotional fulfillment. She was no longer seeking love or even companionship in any meaningful sense. She was simply going through the motions of romantic behavior because she couldn't imagine any alternative way of organizing her personal life. The most devastating realization was that her pursuit of romantic connection had become actively harmful, not just to herself, but to the young men she involved in these arrangements. She was using her power to force people into relationships that made them miserable, and she was too emotionally desperate to care about the damage she was causing. Catherine began to understand that her romantic compulsions had become a form of abuse, both of herself and of others. Number 1. Platon Zubov. Catherine's final significant relationship with Platon Zubov represents the absolute nadir of her romantic life and the most heartbreaking demonstration of how completely power had corrupted her ability to form authentic human connections. When this relationship began in 1789, Catherine was 60 years old and Zubov was 22, making him younger than her own grandson. This relationship would last until Catherine's death 7 years later, not because it provided any emotional satisfaction, but because Catherine had finally given up all pretense of seeking genuine love and had resigned herself to purchasing whatever pale simulation of affection her wealth and power could buy. Zubov came from a minor noble family with no significant political connections or personal wealth. He was physically attractive in a conventional way, but possessed neither intelligence nor education beyond the basic requirements of court etiquette. Catherine chose him precisely because he was so obviously limited that there could be no confusion about the nature of their arrangement. She had finally learned to stop looking for intellectual compatibility, emotional depth, or even basic respect. She simply wanted someone young and pleasant-looking who would perform the role of devoted lover in exchange for material benefits. What made the Zubov relationship different from Catherine's previous arrangements was the complete absence of even pretended emotional investment on both sides. Catherine no longer bothered to convince herself that she was seeking authentic connection. She knew she was buying companionship, and she was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to maintain the illusion of being desired. Zubov, meanwhile, was refreshingly honest about his motivations. He made no attempt to perform affection he didn't feel, and showed no shame about his obvious indifference to Catherine as a person. Catherine's treatment of Zubov was more lavish than anything she had provided for previous favorites. She gave him multiple palaces, enormous estates, a personal fortune that made him one of the wealthiest individuals in Europe, and political appointments that gave him influence over important state matters. She was essentially creating an artificial aristocrat, using her imperial power to transform a minor courtier into a major political figure. But the most shocking aspect of the Zubov relationship was how Catherine allowed him to involve his family in the exploitation of her generosity. Zubov's brothers and other relatives received substantial benefits simply because of their connection to him. Catherine was not just supporting one undeserving favorite, but an entire network of people who saw her as nothing more than a source of unearned wealth and status. The relationship's political consequences were deeply damaging to Catherine's reputation and effectiveness as a ruler. Zubov was completely unqualified for the governmental responsibilities Catherine gave him, but she seemed unable to separate her personal needs from her political judgment. Foreign diplomats reported that important state decisions were being influenced by the whims of an ignorant young man, whose only qualification was his willingness to sleep with an aging empress. Catherine's courtiers and advisors were horrified by how completely she had surrendered her dignity to maintain this arrangement. The woman who had once corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, who had written important legal reforms and expanded Russian territory across 2 continents, was now spending her time planning entertainments for a man who was openly bored by her company and obviously involved with other women. The most tragic aspect of the Zubov relationship was how it revealed the complete failure of Catherine's lifelong search for emotional fulfillment. After 30 years of experimenting with different approaches to romantic relationships, she had achieved only the most hollow and degrading simulation of love. She was paying enormous sums to maintain the company of someone who felt nothing but indifference toward her, and she was grateful for even this minimal level of attention. Catherine's private writings during this period show a woman who had given up all hope of genuine human connection, but couldn't face the alternative of complete solitude. She knew that Zubov despised her, that he was stealing from the state treasury, that he was making a mockery of her authority, but she couldn't bring herself to dismiss him because she couldn't bear the prospect of being alone. The relationship continued until Catherine's death in 1796, not because it provided any satisfaction, but because Catherine had become addicted to the expensive illusion of being desired. She died, having spent the final 7 years of her life in a relationship that was essentially a form of emotional self-harm, paying exorbitant prices for companionship that brought her no joy, and actually increased her feelings of isolation and self-hatred. The ultimate irony of Catherine's romantic life is that the very power that attracted men to her also made authentic love impossible. Every relationship was contaminated by the fundamental inequality between an absolute ruler and her subjects. Men approached her because of what she could provide, not because of who she was as a person. Even when she tried to minimize these inequalities, even when she sought out men who seemed content with subordinate roles, the basic dynamic remained the same. Catherine's tragedy was not that she was unable to find love despite her power, but that she was unable to accept that someone in her position might have to choose between authentic emotional connection and imperial authority. She spent decades trying to have both, creating a series of relationships that satisfied neither her need for companionship nor her responsibilities as a ruler. Modern psychology helps us understand why Catherine's approach to relationships was doomed to fail. Authentic emotional intimacy requires vulnerability, mutual respect, and equality of emotional investment. These conditions are essentially impossible when one person has absolute power over another's life circumstances. Catherine could command obedience, loyalty, and even sexual availability, but she couldn't command love, respect, or genuine affection. Catherine's story also illustrates how the pursuit of romantic connection can become compulsive and self-destructive when it's driven by unmet emotional needs rather than genuine attraction to specific individuals. Catherine wasn't really choosing her lovers based on their individual qualities. She was trying to fill an emotional void that no romantic relationship could possibly satisfy, given the constraints of her position and personality. Perhaps most tragically, Catherine's romantic obsessions prevented her from developing the kinds of relationships that might have provided genuine emotional satisfaction. She had the intelligence, resources, and position to cultivate deep friendships, mentor younger people, or find fulfillment in intellectual and creative pursuits. But her fixation on romantic love blinded her to these alternatives and condemned her to decades of disappointment and increasing desperation. The story of Catherine the Great's romantic life serves as a cautionary tale about the relationship between power and personal fulfillment. It demonstrates how the very achievements that make someone powerful and successful can also make them emotionally isolated and vulnerable to exploitation. Catherine conquered nations and transformed an empire, but she couldn't conquer the fundamental human need for authentic connection, and her attempts to do so ultimately made her one of history's most powerful and most lonely figures. In her final years, Catherine seems to have achieved some level of peace by accepting the limitations of her situation and focusing on her legacy as a ruler rather than her failures as a lover. Her late correspondence shows less desperation about romantic relationships and more concern with ensuring that her political and cultural achievements would be remembered. She had finally learned that some forms of fulfillment are more attainable and more lasting than others. Catherine the Great died on November 6, 1796, at the age of 67. Despite having ruled one of the world's largest empires for 34 years, despite having corresponded with the greatest minds of her era, despite having expanded Russian territory and influence across 2 continents, she spent her final years essentially alone. Zubov was with her when she died, but only because he was contractually obligated to be present, not because he cared about her personally. The woman who had taken over 30 lovers, who had been desired by some of the most powerful men in Europe, who had the resources to command almost any form of companionship she wanted, died without ever experiencing the authentic love she had spent her entire adult life seeking. Her story reminds us that some human needs cannot be satisfied through power, wealth, or even extraordinary achievement. Sometimes, the very things that make us successful in public life make us failures in private life, and no amount of external accomplishment can compensate for the absence of genuine human connection. Catherine's legacy as a ruler remains impressive. She expanded Russian territory, reformed the legal system, promoted education and the arts, and corresponded with the leading intellectual figures of her era. But her personal legacy is a reminder of how completely public success can coexist with private misery, how power can be both the source of great achievement and the cause of profound loneliness. The story of Catherine the Great and her 30 lovers is ultimately not a story about sexual excess or romantic adventure. It's a story about the human cost of absolute power, about the impossibility of authentic relationship when fundamental equality is absent, and about how the search for love can become self-defeating when it's driven by desperation rather than genuine connection. Catherine's romantic life failed not because she chose the wrong men or used the wrong strategies, but because she was trying to solve through personal relationships problems that could only be addressed by accepting the inherent limitations of her position and finding alternative sources of emotional fulfillment. In the end, Catherine the Great's romantic tragedy teaches us that love cannot be commanded, purchased, or achieved through power. It can only be given freely between equals, something that Catherine's position as absolute ruler made impossible. Her story stands as one of history's most poignant examples of how external success can coexist with internal emptiness, and how the very achievements that make someone powerful can also make them profoundly alone.